I'm going to go ahead and get started here and just welcome everybody. Again, this is the Natural Areas Association webinar. My name's Sarah Piers, and I'm really glad you're joining us today from wherever you are. I know that times lately have been stressful and unsettled, and there's been a lot of things changing, but I'm glad that we can get together and talk about Pennsylvania, talk about the biodiversity and the landscapes that make this place special. And I welcome you to just relax, take a deep breath, and give your attention to our speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Charles Beer. He's the Senior Director of Conservation Science with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. Charles is one of Pennsylvania's foremost experts in biodiversity and conservation, and he serves on a number of advisory committees for ecological conservation and stewardship across the Commonwealth. So we're really happy that he can join us today and share his expertise in Pennsylvania's ecology and natural history. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the webinar over to Charles. Charles, I'm not sharing my slides, so you can go ahead and pull up your slides.
Okay. Hello, everyone out there. I'd like to thank the Natural Air Association for having me share this presentation with you today. I hope this isn't the ultimate example of a captive audience, but I'll take it, and glad that you're all here to have me share with you some of my perspectives on the state of Pennsylvania. So I call this Landscapes and Biodiversity of Penn's Woods. Pennsylvania was named after William Penn, and the Sylvia part of the name refers to forest, which we've had a lot of and still have a lot of in Pennsylvania. And there's this saying that's attributed to William Penn to leave 1 acre in forest for every 5 acres cleared. And that's sort of a conservation motto. It was somewhat of utility at his time, but it's something we can think back on as we think about the state and think about the conservation of it. This presentation will be about natural heritage and about the biodiversity of the state. I have a very strong interest in the sort of total definition of biodiversity. So to me, that means ecosystems, that means genetic diversity, the function of landscapes, and of course, most people think of it as being species. And along those lines, I think of it as being all of the species out there. So you'll see a number of those today as we take our tour of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a state insect. It's Photorus pennsylvanica, named after Pennsylvania. So there's a picture of that. Here's a satellite image of Pennsylvania, and it's very instructive if you take a little time to look at this. It means a lot to the rest of our presentation today, and get a sense of this is, of course, a modern satellite image and provides you with some knowledge about both the land cover of Pennsylvania today. You can see the green of the forested areas. Of course, there's forest throughout the state, but it's often very fragmented. And you can also get a sense of where the mountains are. Those fold ridges in the center of the state. The red star is where Pittsburgh is located, and that's the main office of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy that I serve with. Pennsylvania is divided up into different major watersheds. I am not going to spend a lot of time today, or as much time, talking about water, although I will mention it, and I will end with, near the end with it, and give you some examples of the biodiversity and landscapes of Pennsylvania based on water. Pennsylvania has in the neighborhood of 33,000 miles of streams, and it is supposed to be the state that has the highest density of streams in the country. But here you can see examples of the major watersheds, and I'll, as I said, I'll get back to that. In understanding any landscapes in any state, of course, you need to understand the human history that's applied to any of those areas. And having said that, basically, the talk that I'm giving today, any of you could apply it to your own states and consider the different perspectives that I'm introducing today and apply those in a customized way to your own state. Pennsylvania was logged heavily early on. During the period after the Civil War, it was producing more timber than anywhere. So that's been a major influence. And of course, with all the forests and the different types of forests, that meant that there were a lot of timber resources to come out of the state. Early on, in 1859, oil was drilled for the first time in the world here in Pennsylvania. And that went on along with gas development to have a major influence. You can see a late 1880s photograph there in the center of all the oil derricks in part of the state that were being used for extraction early on at that time. Natural gas came a little later, and today we've had a boom of shale gas. We're one of the states producing lots of natural gas today. So we have a realm of natural gas types, from shallow drilling to deeper drilling of the shale gas today. And some of those gas fields are very close together. Some of them were a composite gas and oil. And you can see the distribution of gas here in Pennsylvania, that it's not really found quite everywhere. Perhaps one of the highest influences of natural resource and natural resource extraction on the state of Pennsylvania has been coal. So here's a map that's produced by our state DCNR agency that shows where the coal fields are. And there are basically two types of coal. You can see in the western part of the state, the bituminous fields, and then the anthracite fields, or the hard coal, as it's known, over in the eastern part of the state. Pennsylvania has ranked right up in the top couple of states in the United States for coal production. The influence here for the ecology of the landscape has been fairly drastic. You can see at the top right there, lots of miles of coal impacted streams. And also there are abandoned mine lands that are in a variety of restorations, and their quality varies quite a bit. This is an example of a surface mine that's been restored, at least been restored to grasslands. And it's an example of a new habitat type that's been provided in Pennsylvania. Along with agriculture, these large grassy open areas have sort of called to the birds in the Midwest to come and inhabit Pennsylvania. We have a number of species that were probably rare or non-existent. The grasshopper sparrow in the lower left, Upland sandpiper, and the northern harrier off to the right. Fire has been another influence on the state. Early on, the Native Americans were using fire to manage habitat and probably were responsible for the first major sets of influences on the landscape in terms of changing the vegetation type. This is a map showing the frequency of fire, and the red colors are very frequent, and then up through yellow being moderately frequent. So Pennsylvania's had some, in parts of the state, some kind of moderate frequency of fire, and we're still using it today, especially now that we understand it more and more for habitat management. And then comes the rest of the human influence on the landscape in terms of development. Highways, this is simply an example of an area in Fayette County of southwestern Pennsylvania, showing how over time a patch of forest can go to being fairly contiguous to being diced up on the lower right there with homes and highways. Of course, the major influence also are the cities, which take entire regions of the state and can change them quite a bit away from natural habitats. Other than the man-made influences, something really to pay attention to, and again, this would apply to any state, is the geology. The geology is really a driver in landscapes and across regions for biodiversity. So here you can see a map showing the different geologic periods that influenced Pennsylvania. And this map is one that I like to look at, showing the surface bedrock in Pennsylvania. So everywhere you see a different shape and a different color, there are different types of bedrock that are found in the state. And this will influence quite a bit of the rest of the presentation, and you'll certainly get a flavor for this. The white lines on the map in the northern section represent the terminus of glaciation in Pennsylvania. There have been 4 major glaciers that have come into Pennsylvania, as many of the northern states. And the last one, the Wisconsin, we'll be talking somewhat about, that's had the major remaining influence for us. This map also relates to the biodiversity that we'll be discussing. This is the physiographic section map, and it divides the state up through the geologic formations in the state, the landscape types, and also the bedrock into sections called physiographic provinces and sections. So the mountains of Pennsylvania occurring in this area, and then the rest of the state consists of either foothills or a large area that's simply plateaus. If you take that and use it for the basis of the ecology of landscapes, you end up with things that we'll talk about. However, I do want to point out that this is all relative to something that we call the formation of biogeography. And that term you know about because of penguins. And if you think about penguins and where they're found in the southern hemisphere. And biogeography is simply where life occurs on Earth. And again, if you look over large regions, you'll find out that there are these patterns expressed. And they're largely based on the geology, climate, latitude. You can see the factors there that make up the forces over time that have caused species to find the suitable habitats that they can survive in based on these factors. So in Pennsylvania, the way biodiversity is expressed, we'll go through a couple examples here. And you can see a pattern of biodiversity here with the twisted rose stalk and painted trillium, and or northern latitudes in the state. And you can see that there's this sort of T distribution of where certain species occur, largely again based on elevation or latitude or a combination of those. And here are other examples of biodiversity in Pennsylvania. The snow trillium only comes into the state from the Midwest, occupying a few counties to the left. In the center, we have redbud, a very interesting tree in the pea family, and a calciphile for the most part. And it's found just in Pennsylvania, where there is limestone as basis for forming habitats. And then over on the right is sweet gum, and I want to draw your attention to this area of its range, which is really where it's natural. Sweet gum is a widely planted species in Pennsylvania, and you can see early on there were some other records of this tree that are almost definitely based on the tree's planting. And I should mention these dots are where there are collections of the species. And these collections are a record of their distributions and represent specimens that are found in the museums of Pennsylvania and the United States. In addition to the species themselves, forest ecologists and foresters have divided the state up into major forest types. Some of it is, again, based on kind of a T distribution with the hemlock white pine. And you can see the other forests. And of course, Pennsylvania is a physiographic beast, but it also represents political boundaries. And so it's a little hard to talk about Pennsylvania without recognizing that. And I'll probably be referring to it again in other places. But of course, the mixed mesophytic forest is just reaching the northern limit of its range in Pennsylvania and is coming out of the Appalachian Mountains. Deriving the landscapes into more of an ecological, people are talking about or have been talking about more and more over the last few decades. And here you can see them, and they're ones that are based on, again, kind of a larger regional view outside Pennsylvania, with Pennsylvania cooperating in that larger regional view. And however, we've taken these ecoregions, and much as the physiographic map has different physiographic sections, smaller units, we've taken these and sort of customized this map into one that we'll be using today to take our tour around the state. And so if you can glance at this map for a second and see the ecoregions that we're recognizing, this will give you more of a familiarity with Pennsylvania. But again, mountains, some foothill areas, large area of plateaus. And as I said, this is what we'll use for our tour. So we have a few thousand miles to cover here, and I'd like to get started. This all goes pretty quickly, so I ask for your understanding about that. It's a lot to cover. Over in the southeast, we have the coastal plain. This is an area that is largely formed of sediments coming down the Delaware River. It has a low elevation, you can see down there on the lower right, and the city of Philadelphia, about 1.5 million people, are sitting on this ecoregion and have influenced it quite a bit. One of the places that remains in this ecoregion for some biodiversity to continue to exist is the Delaware River, and you can see it exiting the state in the lower left, and it comes up and forms the border with New Jersey, and the edges of the river itself allow for some natural habitats to continue to exist. Over on the right, you can see one of those major influences on the river is the intertidal zone. And that zone varies quite a bit over time. It'll be pushed up the river depending on tides and so forth. But it has created these intertidal freshwater marshes. These are found along the Delaware, and the water goes up and down, and there are certain species that are adapted to that type of environment. It's interesting that the Bureau of Forestry in Pennsylvania has a suite of natural areas, and these are sort of areas set on a pedestal as representing the different ecological types, habitats in Pennsylvania natural communities. And they actually have one of these sitting in the lower Delaware River right outside of Philadelphia, and you can see the International Airport up here in the upper right. And then examples of these habitats that include a number of species that are found nowhere else in Pennsylvania. Next on our trip, we go to what's called the Piedmont ecoregion. And the Piedmont is a series of rolling hills. It actually has a fairly complex geology. Remember, we're paying a lot of attention to geology here today. And the Piedmont consists of a number of different types of bedrock that make it actually fairly unique. This area is fragmented quite a bit, so there are just little patches of remaining habitat. But I want to make a call out here to the Delaware River. It again is the border of Pennsylvania, with New Jersey there on the right, Pennsylvania on the left. And this is the longest undammed river in the eastern United States. It's fairly clean and provides habitat not only for freshwater mussels. In the upper right, or excuse me, the upper left, you can see the dwarf wedge mussel, which is a federally endangered species, but also for, it's critical for fish in the oceans, and these are fishes that use fresh water to breed, like the American eel, and or parts of their adult life like the American eel, and also the American shad uses this river as part of its life cycle, tying these rivers directly ecologically to the oceans. So this is an example of a patch of habitat protected by natural lands in this Piedmont area. The very rich soils, you can see the showy orchis over there on the left, and this preserve is an example of a fairly rare ecosystem in terms of its being protected, and it was once quite a bit more common in this region. The region also includes some very rare species that are surviving in a fairly fragmented landscape. The federally threatened bog turtle is one of those. Right along the state line in the Piedmont is a very unusual set of natural communities remaining in this fragmented landscape, and they extend into Maryland, but they're only shown in Pennsylvania here, and those are called the Shale Barrens. There is a very unusual and somewhat toxic type of bedrock here, and when the soils have been derived from this bedrock, they have created some toxic environments that only certain plants have been able to survive, plants and also animal habitat that is found in this area. So here's the Serpentine grassland in Lancaster County, and it varies from a woodland to kind of an open glady type environment. Fire is used for the management here, and like many open places in Pennsylvania, it's sort of a constant battle between woody invasion and maintaining these openings where the rare species are found, including some animals like the rough green snake in the upper left and the serpentine aster in the upper right. We're up to the ridge and valley now, the Piedmont being the foothills, and now we're into some true mountains in the ridge and valley. Back to this map again, you can see the geology of this area, and it's over on the right, and it's all these folds of different colors. And I wanted you to compare that with the area just to the left, where we have the Allegheny Mountains that we'll be talking about later. But these are also mountains. The major ridges in the Alleghenies are shown here in the purple color, and those are much more massive mountains than the Appalachians, but and the geology is also different. The valley and ridge is probably the most complex and most diverse out of the ecoregions in Pennsylvania. Here you can see a view with the ridges that are running largely southwest to northeast. And in the lower areas, there's an entirely different type of geology, and we'll go into some of that. These ridge lines are very old mountains. They were quite a bit larger, now have been eroded over the eons, and they're capped with a hard sandstone, Silurian period sandstone, Tuscarora sandstone, and these create a neutral to acidic environment found on the tops of the mountains, while in the valleys you have, remember all those colors that we were looking at, and some of those colors represent shales and limestones that support an entirely different set of biodiversity. Pennsylvania, biodiversity-wise, is probably best known in some circles by Hawk Mountain. And this is on the ridges, in the Ridge and Valley section. These mountains are used for migration of a number of species of raptors that come down, and many of them are on their way to Central and South America, using these ridges as their connectivity within their life cycle. In the mountains also are other species that are on the slopes and up on the tops of the mountains. The Allegheny wood rat, which is a threatened species in Pennsylvania, and the timber rattlesnake are examples of some of those. I mentioned the valleys being of different geologic composition and therefore a different ecological composition. And here's a map that is showing you where limestone is found in Pennsylvania. This is represented in the blue, and you can see a lot of that is over in this Ridge and Valley ecoregion that we're talking about. There's some in Western Pennsylvania. A lot of this is subsurface, is found at the surface in places and does influence the biodiversity there. But over in the Ridge and Valley, you have more of it that is found right at the surface or creates subterranean ecosystems. Again, here is that red bud that I showed you before, a calciphile, and you can see how closely its range here in the center map relates to where limestone is found in Pennsylvania. So this is a native species in Pennsylvania, but you couldn't refer to it as being native everywhere, totally missing in the northern part of the state. I mentioned the subterranean ecosystems, and so most of our caves are found in the Ridge and Valley. At lower elevations, the limestone is at the surface and has been influenced by water over time and creates a whole maze, including places we have no idea about. But here are some of the species that we have been able to study, such as the long-eared bat in the middle there. Also some cave-dwelling arthropods, the Stomax amphipod in the middle, and then Price's cave isopod off to the right. And our only view into these landscapes, or into these subterranean landscapes, is really through caves where you can actually get down and study these organisms. On the surface, we have a number of small natural communities in a lot of cases that remain, and they create soils and outcrops that are favored by certain species that have adapted to live precisely in this kind of environment and in the soil chemistry found in this area. The tall larkspur in the upper left, the Canby's mountain lover, a very rare plant, off to the lower left, and then the northern meadowlark butterfly. That butterfly is an obligate feeding as a caterpillar on roundleaf ragwort, which is again a calciphile, calcium-loving species. Also in this area where the geology is more of shale, especially Devonian period shale, you have something called the Shale Barrens, or the Appalachian Shale Barrens. Again, the northern limit of range for this ecosystem type, and it ranges down through Maryland, West Virginia, and into Virginia. And these are usually slopes above streams. Often they're facing south. They become very dry and hot. So we even have cactus in Pennsylvania. These areas are sometimes referred to as the desert of the east. The Olympia butterfly in the middle feeds on some mustard family species in this area, and you can see the Shale Barrens evening primrose in the upper left, and the ragwort, the cat's paw ragwort in the right. These are obligate species that have to be found. They have to be growing in those hot shale ecosystem. Another example is the Cates Mountain clover. On the right, you can see just how deep the root system is on this clover, and that's an adaptive factor, of course, for living in hot environments. So as the soil becomes parched, it's still able to survive those periods. I'd like to also recognize some of the streams flowing in this area. These are mostly tributaries to the Potomac River, and one of the interesting species found in some of these streams is Spongilla lacustris, a freshwater sponge, which you can see in the lower right and left, which are found in a few places in these streams, and I have not seen it elsewhere in Pennsylvania. The Susquehanna River comes down through the valley and ridge out of other regions in Pennsylvania. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but certainly need to represent it. It is a major population source for certain species of freshwater mussel. Over on the right, in the upper right, you can see buried a yellow lamp mussel, and then just below it, the shell itself. But this is largely a free-flowing river, has some wonderful rocky habitats down through it. We're going to be off now to South Mountain. This is the top of the Blue Ridge coming out of further south in Pennsylvania. It's a fairly acidic environment. It's a different mountain type. Here's a view looking out off of South Mountain, a little lower in elevation, often called the Meeting of the Pines. All of the pine species in Pennsylvania are found in this area. So it's a fairly warm, low, sandy environment. There are places where small wetlands are formed, and you have species such as in the upper left, Arethusa bulbosa, the dragon's mouth orchid, found in these locations. In other places, rather barren like woodlands, which is very suitable for certain rare butterflies and moths and a few rare plant species. Fortunately, in this case, much of this mountain is protected as part of state land, the Michaux State Forest. At the base of this mountain, and this isn't unique for this area, but some of the best vernal pools or seasonal pools are found in this area. And of course, these are wetland basins, usually not that large, that fill up with water in the spring, sometimes in the spring and in the autumn, and create habitat for species that are found around in forests, like the marble salamander and spotted salamander. There's the fairy shrimp off there to the right that goes dormant when the pools dry up. And then the northeastern bulrush in the upper left, a federally threatened species, is found where these habitats provide fluctuating water that's it's adapted to. Off to our last mountainous area in Pennsylvania, which are the Alleghenies. This is where our highest elevation is in Pennsylvania. As you approach the Alleghenies from the west, you see these large mountains that are slowly folding. Here's an example from the air of Laurel Ridge and Chestnut Ridge. Here's the laurel, and chestnut is found over here. And this is the Allegheny River. In the Allegheny Mountains, one of the key features is this river that comes, it's a northward flowing river, which is a bit unusual in Pennsylvania, coming out of the southern Appalachians, well, the Appalachians to the south of us, Maryland, part of West Virginia. And it cuts through these two ridges on its way to join the Monongahela River. This is the small town of Ohiopyle, and it's found right along the river, and you can see these sort of white splashes here along the river, and we'll look at those in a second. The river here, due to geological forces, makes this big bend in the river, and it creates something called Ferncliff Peninsula. Around Ferncliff are a variety of rapids and riffles. There's one large waterfall in the upper left, which is a 40-foot waterfall. If you were floating down the river, as many people do every year, take raft and kayak trips, this is the view you would have of many boulders sitting in the river. And then off to the sides, scour areas. This is where floodwaters and ice and debris actually keep the vegetation, most of the vegetation, off these areas and create rather unique habitats along the Allegheny River. One of the highest densities of the northern copperhead that I've seen. It's especially important because of the rare plants that it supports with these scoured habitats. Marshallia or barber's buttons in the upper left, Carolina tasselroot in the upper right. Some other plants found in this region, going counterclockwise, buffalo nut, sand grape, blue monkshood, Appalachian fern, and the rock skullcap. Again, these are largely regional endemics to this ecoregion in Pennsylvania. Some species reach their northern limit of range. You can see the Fraser's magnolia actually was just recently discovered in Pennsylvania, much more common in West Virginia to the south, and also the green salamander, which is a species that is obligate on different types of rock outcrops where it lives in the crevices, and it is a species that is adapted to live in those crevices. But you can see the limit of the range there coming just barely into Pennsylvania in Fayette County, and that's the same area where the Allegheny River is found. We're out of the mountains now, and the rest of the presentation will be looking at plateaus. So no more folding and faulting of major landscapes and regions, but these are all areas that have been deposited in a fairly level fashion in terms of the bedrock, and then have been carved down through over the years through erosion and through the streams that occur in this region. So here's a view. You can see the plateau tops are about the same elevation, usually in the high Allegheny ecoregion, about 2,000 feet or higher. This is a view again of that region showing the west branch of the Susquehanna River flowing through. The forests here are similar to some of the forests in the mountains, but the northern hardwoods and hemlock forests are fairly common. These are many of the forests that have been cut for resources in the past. Some of these are reverting to a strange mix of trees still trying to grow, but due to past practices and high deer populations, you sort of ferny glades that occur in the northern hardwoods hemlock forest. Most of our old growth forests are found in this area. We have one of the oldest, largest old growth forests found in, it's called the Tinesta Natural and Scenic Area, about 4,000 acres, and a few other places such as Heart's Content, this shown here. These are often forests that include some component of hemlock. And in these old growth forests, there's great habitat for unusual bird species for Pennsylvania, the Swainson's thrush on the left, and also the Blackburnian warbler on the right. High densities of species like the Blackburnian. But overall, the forests in these areas represent very high quality interior forests, and species of warblers are considered, along with the scarlet tanager in the lower left, or in the center, as being a forest interior bird species that are dependent on these dense contiguous forests. But here you also find species such as the mountain earth snake and the northern water shrew on the lower right. In areas where the landscape has less soil and it's shallow with what we call shallow to bedrock, so the bedrock is fairly close to the surface. You have these acidic wetlands. Here's an example of one, and again, this is a natural area within the state forest system. Off to the east, we have one of our glaciated sections in Pennsylvania, the northeast glaciated section here on this physiographic map. Again, these are the glacial deposits of Pennsylvania. This is the area that we're looking at, and it's been most influenced by the Wisconsin and the Illinois glacier And again, these are massive sheets of ice that came down, and they brought with them a lot of sediments. And in the Northeast, one of the key things to remember is that the sediments brought by the glaciers of an acidic nature, neutral to acidic. And so they have created lakes and bogs that, again, are acidic, low pH, and the species that are surviving there represent that kind of habitat. There are 2 species of cranberry, and those cranberry are food for the caterpillar of the bog copper, this butterfly in the upper right. So there's an obligate relationship there, and an obligate relationship of the cranberries to the acidic wetland habitats. So these are unique areas where, as the conservationist, we have to recognize again, the phrase that not every acre is created equal. In the lower center here, we have an example of some of the coniferous plants that are found in these wetlands, such as Sarracenia purpurea, the pitcher plants. Other examples, here is a glacial lake ringed with some of these acidic wetlands. These are, Pennsylvania only has about 83 natural bodies of water. Most of these, about 75 of them, are found in the upper eastern, this part of the state. They're all formed by glacial forces. And where there aren't lakes, there are depressions that are bogs. So here's an area where there's spruce and fir, balsam fir, and tamarack, creating a very northern environment. One of the places that the yellow-bellied flycatcher, which is a northern species, finds habitat. Just sitting off from the glacier, also representative of glacial influence is this Pocono Plateau area. And this is a fairly unique area. It represents a large area of glacial outwash coming into Pennsylvania from the northeast, and has formed a blanket of sediments across the area. There's this one ecosystem called the Long Pond Mesic Till Barrens. You can try to ignore the Pocono Raceway over here, which was not deposited by the glaciers. But this area is a unique kind of woodland, a set of wetlands, or the wet soils throughout this area, and includes variable sedge and rhodora off to the right as species that are found in this environment. We then want to go over to the glaciated northwest. In this area, again, one of the lobes of the Wisconsin Glacier that came down and most recently influenced this area brought quite a bit of material into the area and carved out the valleys and deposited a lot of fill. So in Pennsylvania, when we walk through this area, one thing that we see are these round boulders. Many of these are granite. The large ones are called glacial erratics. And they're often formed from granite. We have no granite formed in Pennsylvania, but there was quite a bit of it brought into the state. And this set of sediments that were brought in by the glaciers have been deposited in streams. A lot of these yellow elongate features here are stream valleys, and this has created the type of sediments on the right there that you can see, which are good habitat for certain species. Our largest wetlands are found up in the northwest. This is Conneaut Marsh, an expanse that is quite a bit protected by State Game Lands 213. And you can see that it is expansive, and it's important habitat for a number of bird species. You can see the Berthonter warbler. I hope you can find the American bittern in this shot as it tries to be camouflaging, and the common gallinule. A really unique aspect of this area is, however, the limestone that the glacier brought here, and not into the northeastern Pennsylvania that we just looked at earlier. type of habitat created here is known as the calcareous fen, and it is formed when glacial groundwater emerges in the landscape and forms a peaty soil, and is habitat for a unique set of species found in these areas. The spreading globe flower in the upper left, in the lower left is Queen's lady slipper. As I mentioned, the only natural bodies of water in Pennsylvania are glacial lakes, and there are about 8 of those that occur in the northwestern part of Pennsylvania. And these are, again, a type of ecosystem and provide habitat for species that are just not found in those northeastern lakes or found in most other places in Pennsylvania. This one in Erie County is known as Lake Pleasant. It's a relatively small glacial lake, but between the lake and the calcareous surrounding wetlands, it is home for unusual species. In the lower left, you can see Beck's water marigold, an aster family species that's kind of fascinating. It lives underwater until it's time to produce its flower, and then it protrudes a stem above the surface and blooms. At the terminus of the Wisconsin Glacier down in Butler County, we have this place called Jennings, and this is named after an early botanist out of Carnegie Museum that discovered this site. And it's sort of an outwash area from the glacier that has quite a bit of groundwater influence to it, just under the surface, and it has these openings that Otto Jennings discovered, and he thought it was a remnant of the Prairie Peninsula into Pennsylvania. That's somewhat debated, but it's not debated that it is a relatively unique habitat and quite special. So it is named after this plant in the upper left, the dense blazing star, and has other plant species that are fairly unusual growing in it. There's a swamp thistle off to the right. And then it's also the home for the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, a federally threatened and state endangered small rattlesnake that's found here. And it has to have a habitat like this because it spends the winter in crayfish burrows just under the surface where the groundwater is found. Another habitat maintained by fire and is kind of a constant battle against woody shrubs and trees. Next, we're up to Lake Erie, and this is a very unique part of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania did not have parts of Lake Erie until 1792, and Congress decided to expand the state up to meet the lake and give it a harbor and a port. And here we find the most unusual part of this ecoregion is a place called Presque Isle. And Presque Isle is a sand spit, a peninsula that goes off into the lake and kind of bends around and provides a lot of Great Lakes habitats for species. You can see here, it's kind of a constantly growing, there's a sand transport up along the edge of the peninsula. There are sand dunes that are formed. You can see these consecutive ridges. In between them are either moist palestrin sand plains or drier sand plains that create a lot of interesting habitats. And this place has the highest density of rare species occurring of anywhere in Pennsylvania, although a lot of those species are fairly common in the Great Lakes area. But not the piping plover, which has recently returned there to nest in the upper center. And in the lower center, you can see one of the tiger beetle species, that group of insects in the state of Pennsylvania. Another feature in this region, quite a bit of the lakefront are formed by these lake sediment bluffs. When Lake Erie was larger, it set down these sediments, and on them you can find seepages, which form a variety of habitats for some rare species like the colmobilia in the lower center. You can see one of the seepages here, and then Grassa parnassus and golden fruited sedge are the other two species found here. And then in the upper right, interesting to note that on the face of these bluffs where the some erosion has occurred are nesting colonies of bank swallows. Going south then to another part of the plateau area, this is a lower region than the high plateau. The major human feature here is the city of Pittsburgh, but I wanted to note the Monongahela River coming out of West Virginia, flowing here, and the Allegheny River coming south and forming the Ohio River, a major tributary of the Mississippi. This landscape is largely fragmented. There are small farms there. It's become somewhat of an area of sprawl. Low hills, again, it is a plateau. There's no folding or faulting of mountains here. It's simply a flat plateau that's been eroded down with valleys over time. There are small patches of important habitats here. Some forest interior birds, such as the wood thrush, continue to survive here. And in these patches of habitats and in some of the streams are other species. We looked at the snow trilliums range earlier coming out of the Midwest. That's the center flower here. And the cerulean warbler, West Virginia white butterfly, the Cambarus monongaheliensis, named after the Monongahela River, is the blue crayfish, and then the queen snake are all species found in this lower plateau ecoregion. A subsection of this is a place called the Waynesburg Hills. It is mostly drained by tributaries to the Ohio River in West Virginia, and it has a set of species that are more Midwestern or Ozarkian. It includes the federally listed buffalo clover, the summer tanager, Jeffersonia, blue-eyed Mary, and Trillium sicily, found here in the center toad trillium. As I said before, that was largely a terrestrial and palustrin view of Pennsylvania. Now I just wanted to touch a little bit on the water, the sheds of the major water basins of the state. Here they are. And an important thing to recognize for the naturalist and the biogeographer is this difference between the Atlantic slope drainages and the Mississippian drainages. And you can see the continental divide that runs up through the state. And even the Lake Erie system is going out the St. Lawrence and part of the Northern Atlantic. So it belongs in this group of streams right here, the major basins which are flowing in that direction. What's interesting is to note the number of species of aquatic organisms represented by freshwater mussels and fishes found in these different basins. And so on the left, you can see for each major basin the number of freshwater mussels, and then on the right the number of fishes found there. And the Mississippi drainage, which is a much older drainage and consists of a variety of different habitats and different subdrainages with very diverse geologies. It has a higher diversity of species, both in freshwater mussels and in fishes. Not only is it higher, but also to note that there are very few species that are actually shared across this continental divide. For example, out of the freshwater mussels, only 2 species are common between the Atlantic and the Mississippian, so otherwise they have unique species. Up here in the Lake Erie drainage, there's kind of a mystery because the species richness for an Atlantic slope drainage is not the same or similar to these other ones, and that has to do with a glacial late glaciation occurrence of the transfer of species from one system to another. So here over in the western Lake Erie Basin, you can see we have the Maumee River, which is traveling into Lake Erie, as it does now, and then the Wabash River through Indiana. And in the late Pleistocene times, the Lake Maumee, due to glacial meltwaters, was expanding, and eventually dumped into the ancestral Wabash River. At that time, it allowed species from the old Ohio and Taze River system to be transferred into Lake Maumee and into the Great Lakes. So the geologists tell us that's our reason why there's a discontinuity between this Atlantic slope St. Lawrence biodiversity and that of the other Atlantic drainages. I'll give you an example of the importance of Pennsylvania and its rivers to the remaining biodiversity. And that has to do with the Allegheny and the French Creek watersheds. There was this publication formed back in 1998, The Rivers of Life, that was an accumulation of data across Pennsylvania and all of the other states to try to determine which of the major ecosystems were the most important and the most endangered in terms of the loss of biodiversity. And one of those systems that came out was the Allegheny River, the upper, what we call the middle Allegheny River, and French Creek that was shown on the previous map. An example of that diversity is exemplified by the replacement of this bridge. And it's across the Allegheny River where the Allegheny is free flowing. And the importance of this project is when they replaced this bridge, they had to save the mussels that were found there because there are a number of endangered species. And you may know that freshwater mussels represent the group that represents the highest percentage within the group of endangered and extinct species that we have in North America. So there was this large project over 3 years that collected all of the species of mussels, and then a number of those were moved elsewhere in Pennsylvania or elsewhere in seven different parts of the Ohio drainage far from Pennsylvania where the species had declined or become extinct. So here you can see the sheepnose mussel, the club shell, and northern riffle shell, and you can see just the massive numbers of mussels that were found as part of this project. And what's really surprising is that there were 134,900 individual mussels that were collected from the area where they had to drop this bridge into the river to replace it. And out of the 23 species represented by that roughly 135,000 species, 72% of them were endangered. So 4 federally listed species and populations that represent some of the best left on Earth for some of these species that have declined by 90%, 95% of their ranges. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on this conservation message, and it has to do with what we've just discussed here. We've gone across Pennsylvania and looked at Pennsylvania in part, not only due to its geology, but due to its geology and elevation. So we did this little exercise. We took Pennsylvania and we turned it sideways and then cut it off at 1,200 feet. And that's what this map represents. The darker, the black is where there are lower elevations, and the light color is where the elevations are higher. We then laid over the protected lands onto that map. And the message is that where we've protected lands in Pennsylvania are in places where the land was cheaper and we weren't using that land for other reasons. And so we set up our conservation reserves in the form of state forests, parks, and federal lands in this region. But the result is that Pennsylvania is not quite split half and half between that cutoff elevation of 1,200 feet, but we've ended up with this lopsided protection of biodiversity, where the lands protected under 1,200 feet are much, much less than those protected over 1,200 feet. And of course, as you've just experienced, those lower elevation diverse ecosystems, landscapes, habitats are supporting a lot of species that are not found at those higher elevations and never will be. Of course, this is also a big message for those of us that are concerned about biodiversity and how it will respond to climate change, and where the species will have opportunities to move. We did a conservation map on that principle, and in blue are areas that have received less protection and have higher biodiversity, and in yellow are the places that are high elevation and places we've also had quite a bit of protection, and then the orange is kind of areas that represent values in between. With that, I would like to say thank you, and also thank you to these folks that have helped me put this presentation together.
Great, thank you, Charles. That was great information. It was, I think, as I said yesterday to Charles, it was like a hike across the entire state of Pennsylvania with about 200 other people in about an hour's time. So that's pretty cool. If you'd like to stick with us, we're going to turn our attention to some questions here. I'm just going to put up my screen here, and then we'll get going with some questions. So there were some questions about hemlock woolly adelgid, specifically how hemlocks in the state of Pennsylvania are faring and whether we're starting to see some white pine impacts.
White pine impacts.
Right. Has there been some host switching happening in Pennsylvania, or not yet?
There, in terms of host switching of the adelgid from hemlock to white pine, that will not happen. The hemlock woolly adelgid is it's an obligate species as far as is known on hemlock species, which is the genus Tsuga, which have a representation from North America and also from Eastern Asia, where the hemlock adelgid first came from. But there is no switch from, this species is very tied into hemlock, so it will not be switching to white pine. And the hemlocks, yeah, the hemlocks have declined in places. It takes a while for it to actually happen, but we totally lost some of the hemlocks out of unique habitats.
Right. And there was a follow-up question to that, whether or not there would be impacts to the spread of HWA due to gas well development. Whether gas well development slows the spread of HWA, hemlock woolly adelgid.
Gas development would have the potential to assist with the spread due to this insect is not spread very quickly. It's largely by wind, or it can be transferred by humans. So like many invasive species of plants, it's possible that gas development or any kind of movement of people would be able to transfer the aphid from one place to another.
Great, thanks for that. So from a very specific question to a more general question, folks are asking for recommendations of books or other resources on Pennsylvania's ecoregions and the species that characterize them. Essentially, where can they go for more information beyond our presentation, Charles?
Yeah, there are not actually any. In fact, it's been suggested to me that maybe I should put this into some sort of publication to share. But I don't know, Sarah, if we could post some resources online afterwards, but there is a large atlas of Pennsylvania, kind of a coffee table size book that has quite a bit of this information, or at least a general overview of this type of information together. It's called the Atlas of Pennsylvania.
We can certainly put together a list of other resources for folks. So another question, folks are interested in your favorite sites. What are your favorite sites to visit that might be open to the public, where people could go and maybe see some of these landscapes, or maybe some of the species that you've talked about and that capture your attention?
That's a tough one to have favorites. Well, I can think of a few, and I mentioned the Allegheny River Valley down in Fayette County. That's the one in the Allegheny Mountains, and that's a fantastic landscape to be part of. And Ohiopyle State Park and a few game lands in that area provide access to parts of the habitats that are there. You can float the river, you can walk different trails. That's a great one. In the northwest of Pennsylvania, those habitats up there that are limestone-based habitats are really fascinating. A number of the glacial lakes are available to recreate on, to canoe on, to explore some of the edges of those. And then the high plateau, in terms of more aesthetical areas, is wonderful. It's a place where you can get out and see the dark sky if you're backpacking, or experience some of those really wild places like Susquehanna Wild Area.
Great. And then a question about climate change, particularly how climate change will affect biodiversity in Pennsylvania. Taking into account the idea that there will be northern range shifts for some species into Pennsylvania, and then for some species there could be northern range shifts out of Pennsylvania. So what's sort of the expected overall outcome for biodiversity in the Commonwealth?
Well, as I suggested in the very end of the presentation, a big concern with biodiversity conservationists is how are the species going to be able to move in a rather fragmented and, in some cases, less protected landscape. Some of the species that need the mountain ridges to move on, or places in the high plateau, I don't think will be in the same situation as the more vulnerable species found on those shale barrens, or in some of the limestone habitats that just where we haven't applied that protection. If you remember the difference between the amount of protection at the lower elevations, and those are relatively fragmented landscapes. So we're all kind of scratching our heads now as to how, in particular, those species are going to be able to move around. I think the species that can utilize the more common types of forests and the ridges and high plateau, they will be in much better shape.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question about how we can do more conservation, protect more of these species and special places across the Commonwealth. One viewer points out that the Chesapeake Bay currently gets a lot of attention and funding, but there's a question about how we can generate more attention, more protection, more funding across the entire state. And I mean, I would initially offer, if you're interested in conservation, support your local conservation group, whether it's a land trust, including the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, support the Natural Areas Association and join us as a member. There are lots of organizations that are involved in conservation across the Commonwealth. But Charles, I'll also turn that question over to you. What can people do to support and increase conservation across Pennsylvania?
Well, Sarah, I think you did a good answer to that question. The one I would put a question back to people. Is the interest just in conserving parts of landscapes, or is it in protecting biodiversity? Of course, this presentation was sort of about both, however, with a heavy emphasis on biodiversity. And if that's the case, if you want to join me to help protect biodiversity, then I think everyone out there protecting land should look at their own landscapes in ways maybe that they haven't before, and find out where kind of the biodiversity refugia are, or hotspots, and try to focus in on the protection of those. The Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program is just one of many heritage programs in all of the states in the country, and they have the wealth of information about where these areas are across states. And I would advise people to go to the Natural Heritage Program website and learn a little bit more about that.
Great. Well, thank you, Charles, for your time. Thanks everyone who's joining us. We really appreciate the opportunity to get together and think about Pennsylvania, think about the species and the places that really inspire us, that we care about, and that we want to protect. So thanks everybody. Stay safe, stay connected, and let's flatten the curve. Thank you. Bye.